Welcome to Eastlake. We are an inclusive faith community dedicated to the free search for truth and meaning, seeking to live out a more just and life-giving spirituality in the modern world. We see faith as less about doctrines and dogmas demanding total agreement, but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others. What unites us is a growing awareness that life is a gift and love is the point. We welcome the entire human family, regardless of race, age, creed, physical abilities, marital or economic status, gender identity, or sexual orientation. So if you are curious and have come to see, if you are tired and have come to rest, if you are grateful and have come to share, if you are journeying and have come to grow, if you are wounded and have come to heal, if you are joyful and have come to shine, welcome home. Today, we hear from Kent Dobson as he continues our series, Yes, but What About Jesus? Please check the description for links to our quarterly Spotify playlist and guided meditation.
Yes, welcome back. Welcome to Eastlake. My name's Kent Dobson. Week 3. This is week 3 on a little series that I'm calling Yes, but What About Jesus? And so let's start with a quotation. Let's start with a quotation from Jesus. What I think is his most enigmatic, mysterious, cryptic, mystical, Zen-like koan sort of statement. He says, unless a grain of wheat dies, it remains a single seed. But if it dies and goes into the ground, it reaps a great harvest. Unless a grain of wheat dies and goes into the ground, it remains a single seed. But if it dies and goes into the ground, it reaps a great harvest. What's he talking about? What is Jesus talking about on the deepest level? On the level of the soul, on the level of symbolic truth? What's he pointing toward? I'm sure you've heard that fantastic Buddhist line, a finger pointing to the moon. So Jesus is pointing to something. And what is he pointing toward? And today's talk, the sort of final installment of this conversation about Jesus, which is going to be about this passage. This final teaching is going to be about this passage and about the symbolic nature of it. And one way of putting it, at least in my view, is that this image, this grain of wheat, is at the very center of the Christ symbol. And it's meant to not only reveal something to us about the nature of reality, but I think invite us into a process that we undergo. So that's what I want to talk about today. And if you're just joining us, and this is maybe the first week, you can go back and check out the previous weeks. I wanted to have a conversation about Jesus because I think it matters now more than ever. And I think it matters because something about the Christ image sits in the collective Western psyche, in the collective Western consciousness, and for better or worse. And of course, Jesus has been co-opted and used and abused and privatized by every kind of group and individual that you can possibly imagine. So you might think, hey, just enough is enough. Let's send him out of the city. Let's scapegoat him like the Romans did and his own people, some of Jesus's own Jewish enemies. Let's blame him and send him out of the city. And I think, no, not quite, because symbols arrive in the collective sphere with a certain kind of invitation. And one of the questions I'm carrying and holding is, what kind of invitation is the Jesus symbol right now in the 21st century inviting us into? And I think the clue here is in this grain of wheat image. And I want to be kind of clear from the beginning, as clear as one can be about these things, about a finger pointing to the moon, to a mystery, in other words. The grain of wheat symbol is about the death and resurrection of something. It's about descent and return. To use contemporary psychological language, it's about the death of who we think we are. It's about the death of the ego. And I think it's also larger than the personal ego. If there's such thing as a collective ego or a collective consciousness, which there certainly is, it's about the death of that. It's about undergoing something. It's about going into the ground, into that fertile, mysterious, womb-like darkness so that something new can be born. I wish there was another way. I wish the evolution in consciousness, I wish growth and change, just to be more simple and sound less fancy, was just a matter of like, hey, I just read a couple books and, just boom, just nailed it, just got on that higher plane of consciousness, just manifested it. I think, no, that's not, for some reason, that's not the way human beings evolve and change and grow. It's through a death and resurrection. That's what the Christ symbol is saying. And so when Jesus says, unless a grain of wheat dies, you could say, well, he's talking about himself. He's alluding to something. And I think, yeah, he's alluding to something. He's alluding to what he's undergoing and even a bit of foreshadowing. I think when you're in tune with something, with the truth, you can see down the road a bit. And I think that's what's happening here with Jesus. He knows that the prophetic, mystical, and mysterious train that he's on is going to end, from a popular point of view, from a cultural point of view, in a kind of disaster, because the culture says no. We'd rather remain in our illusions than be challenged. And so he can see that he's going to go into the ground and die. And maybe he's giving his own followers a kind of clue that it's the beginning of something, not the end of something. But more than that, and I think deeper than that, he's saying, unless a grain of wheat dies and goes into the ground, he's saying, this is the central symbol. This is it. This is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm inviting you into. As much as you can, and maybe it's a mixture. I was going to say as much as you choose it, but it's always a mixture. It's something you choose and something you don't. And I think the paradox doesn't need to be resolved. You say yes to it, and it's also something that comes to you. The stripping of our illusions, the death of who we think we are. It's one of those mysteries. And Jesus is saying, I'm embodying this and modeling this so that you know that it's real. It's real in the flesh. It's not an idea up here. I guess the Christian word for it is incarnation. The spiritual word for it is embodiment. It's meant to be embodied. The spiritual-ish word. So I'm trying to speak about something that's hard to speak about. And I just made an audiobook called A Grain of Wheat. So I've been thinking about this for a while. And you can check out the full audiobook. I look at 7 symbols of the life of Jesus. And I'm not really saying that as an advertisement, although I guess it is kind of an advertisement. I'm saying if this resonates with you, I have some more things to say about it. And I really am trying to just be a participant in the conversation, not offer some kind of final word on, as if that's possible, on Jesus or the Christ symbol. But I'm saying right now, for some reason in the 21st century, it's time to wrestle again with this image and with this mysterious figure from the past that seems to transcend and does transcend his own historical circumstances. So that's where I'm going today. And I hope you'll come with me. And I'm so glad to be a kind of honorary member of the East Lake family, even though I live in Michigan. And now what is a church and what is Eastlake is expanding out beyond the borders of some sort of the Pacific Northwest, you could say. And I think that's really important. I think Eastlake, like I said before, is out on the leading edge of what does a modern spiritual community look like in the 21st century? And that's to be explored, not to be answered. And I think Eastlake is courageous in its capacities to try to push that forward. And I think in doing so, help people and help other kinds of communities. So anyway, I'm really grateful to be here and to be able to speak about these things. So yeah, that was my introduction, a 9-minute introduction. So I want to add in maybe one other image that I think is related. So the grain of wheat is a death, underground, underworld process and an emergence. And that's very much like one other metaphor and symbol that Jesus uses. He says, no sign will be given to you except the sign of Jonah. It's the same thing. The sign of Jonah is that descent, return. It's being thrown overboard of the ship of your life. Just when you think you're, at the helm and, oh, captain, my captain, or I am the captain of my fate. And you've got your ship ordered and you think you know where you're going and your compass works. And it's at that moment that a storm comes and threatens to unravel the path that you're on. And pretty soon your own acquaintances throw you overboard and you're in the sea and then you're drowning and then you're swallowed by an underworld fish and you're in the belly of a whale and you're in the tomb and you're in the womb. And in that mystical, alchemical undoing of who we think we are, something gets rearranged and we're spit out on another shore. That's the sign of Jonah. Same thing. So Jesus is trying to be as clear as he can and still remain, one of those teachers that's hard to pin down. So he's being as clear as he can that this is about descent and about undoing. When people say, yeah, I feel like my faith is unraveling, I think, good. Finally, we're getting somewhere. But I don't celebrate it like, ha ha ha, now you must suffer. It's not that kind of thing. It's a loss, it's a grief. And it's a moving into the zone unknown, as I was speaking about in the previous weeks. So I want to try to define some terms because one of the things that I want to say is that what dies is a bit of our own egos. And ego is one of those overused words, and people mean different things by them. And by the way, that's not reason to stop using them. I think we should still use words like soul and God and mystery and and ego, for that matter, because there's a richness to them. They're multi-layered. But here, I want to try to be clear about what I mean by ego, because spiritual teachers often say, oh, that the problem is ego. And if you could just eliminate ego and live egoless, you'd be like good to go. I remember I was talking with a pastor and he was speaking about another pastor at his same church. And he said that the great thing about him is that he's egoless. And I think, not possible. And what do you mean by that? And, maybe he meant he's not a bully. I mean, that's just what he meant, because sometimes we associate a big ego with a bully. But I'll try to say what I mean by it. So ego is the tip of an iceberg. And the tip of the iceberg, the very top, is our conscious awareness, who we think we are at any given moment, the I that's right now giving this talk. My ego is involved. I'm aware that I'm giving a talk, and I'm aware to a certain extent to whom I'm speaking and the context in which I'm speaking. And I'm conscious of it. That's all that's meant by ego. It's our conscious awareness, who we think we are at any given moment. Maybe in front of that, by the way, this is an aside, we have our persona, the mask, the face that we put out there, our Facebook profile, our Instagram, our roles. That's the persona, that means mask. Just behind the mask is our ego, our conscious awareness. Now, the question is there anything beyond the ego? And the answer to that question is yes. Our subpersonalities, our complexes, our shadows, and what I would call the soul. And maybe even beneath the soul, which is something like the essence of who we are, there's an abyss out of which our life dimly emanates. That's a line from Teilhard de Chardin. I sense there's an abyss out of which my life, the thing I call my life, the current, dimly emanates. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about, the mystery of being, And when we have contact with that, with the underworld, we could say, and that's the ancient word for it, the underworld, the ground, the tomb, the womb, the belly of the whale, there's always a dismantling and an unraveling of the tip of the iceberg, the ego consciousness. So things like when our life falls apart through a massive invasion of love or a massive invasion of disaster, or something in us begins to wake up and we experience the cracking of the ego, something mysterious and good and even dangerous is happening. It's dangerous because we don't know that much about the underworld. We don't know about what we might discover. Now, to come back to the metaphor, let's just put the ego in there for a moment. Unless your ego dies, it remains a single seed. All right? And let me say that in contemporary terms. Unless who you think you are dies, you remain very boring and one-sided, very sure of who you are. I know my Enneagram number, I know my Myers-Briggs, I know my strength. I've taken strengths finders, I know who I am, I know what I'm doing in the world. That's kind of so boring, and you're remaining just a single seed at that point. Now, you're a seed, but you're just a single seed. There's not much richness there. So to use the image, if you go into the ground and you die, there's an unraveling, a dismantling, a going into the tomb, a going into the womb, a going into the belly of the whale, then the possibility of a great harvest is present, to reap 100-fold, for that seed to become a field of wildflowers. Yeah, just a single seed, just out emanating like rings in the pond. Yeah, so like the idea that Jesus is saying, I'm inviting you to undergo something. He's saying, it's worth it. It's worth it, because when that small self, maybe that's a good way of putting it, the small self gets shattered, the deep self can emerge in its place. Now, it's scary, it's dangerous. That's what people mean by deconstruction. It's not that much fun, but it's absolutely essential. It happened to Jesus, we could say. It happened to the disciples. Like Jesus saying to Peter, hey, when you're young, you went and did whatever you wanted. But when you're old, you'll be led by a way you know nothing about. It's the very end of the Gospel of John. It's a bit of my translation. You think you know until you don't, and then it feels like you're blind and you're led, and the world becomes a mystery again. And why? For what purpose? Why would we have to undergo this? I don't know. I can't answer that. It seems to be just part of the human condition. Even part of the evolutionary process, that we begin by needing to develop an ego. It's absolutely essential. I mean, it's not bad, it's good, it's needed, it's necessary. We develop a personality and we learn to interact socially, and we learn to hold down a job, and we learn to be a good boy or a good girl, or a bad boy or a bad girl. Those are all Those are all energies we might live into, we could say, or even personalities. And people know us by name, and we know other people by name. And good, healthy ego development, we need all that just to get going, because it's hard. Life is hard. It's hard to grow up. But the depths, the soul, the thing we were meant to carry in the world, to be in the world, to embody in the world, to discover that, there has to be a shattering. And I don't know why. It's just as old as any story. It's as old as any myth and legend and fairy tale. It's in there, if you have eyes to see and ears to hear, and it's in the Christ story. And Christ is embodying that and talking about it and even warning people. This is the way. And may we find ways to say yes to it. Yeah, so, okay, that's what I meant by ego. Let me say something else. There is a personal and a transpersonal dimension to what I'm speaking about here. I'm talking about personal transformation, I am. But I'm not just talking about personal transformation. I'm talking about collective transformation. Like, I don't know if I quoted before, because I like to quote it all the time, but Einstein saying, no problem can be solved by the same consciousness that created it. So he's saying you and I personally need a change of consciousness. And also the big questions, the big problems, and there are tons of them right now. Population and economy and viruses and climate crises and race and warfare and nuclear weapons. And I mean, okay, we could just sit here and just make the list longer and longer and longer and more complicated. We have some big things, which starts with personal transformation that is directly interwoven with collective change of consciousness and transformation. To talk about one is to talk about the other. Now, my guess is you cannot go around the personal nature of things. I think that's what all the great stories, myths, and legends say, and I think that's in the Christ story. That's even what, to use an old-fashioned Baptist language, that's what's meant by personal salvation. You must undergo something. You don't just talk about it on the collective level, and that's the problem with politics right now. Everything is talking about the systems that need to change and the structures that need to change, and all of that. I say, yeah, but how? And it's complicated because you can change laws and messaging and structures. You can work toward that. But if you're not working on the personal level, if you're not uncovering what's sort of beneath there, you can only go so far. That's I think is true. So let's just hold it as a paradox that doesn't need to be resolved, which is where I'm going with this entire talk, by the way. Personal and transpersonal, they hold hands. Okay. Two stories. The first comes from the very end of the life of Jesus. Jesus is on the cross, and he says, quoting from a psalm, my God, why have you forsaken me? My God, why have you forsaken me? It's one of the darker passages in the entire New Testament. From the entire life and narrative of Jesus. It's one of the darker images. My God, why have you forsaken me? I don't think Jesus is faking it. Like, oh, I'm going to pretend because I'm really, the Son of God. And, I'm just saying this for others' benefit. No, I think Jesus is experiencing being forsaken by God, by the divine, by the mystery, by having the divine, the mystery turn his or her back on Jesus. He's experiencing that. Do you know what that's like? One part of me knows exactly what that's like. And in fact, we could even say that Jesus is experiencing the death of God. Like Nietzsche says, God is dead and we have killed him. And there's not enough water in the world to wash the blood off our hands. Yeah, quote the full thing. If you're going to say God is dead and quote Nietzsche, keep going. I mean, yeah, and we have killed him. How? Through our own sophistication and technology and scientific facts, which ask any scientist and they'll tell you, we're not dealing with facts. We're dealing with the leading edge of evidence, which is evolving and changing constantly. It's much more like a spiritual discipline in its posture than the way people talk about facts. But anyway, why have you forsaken me? What I think the narrative is saying here of the life of Jesus is that we undergo, if the grain of wheat is going to go into the ground, we also undergo the death of God, of who we think God is, what we even think, how we would even define God. Unless that dies, it remains something you put on a shelf in a library book that has to be protected and guarded and honored and defended. And we can create whole seminaries to defend this seed, this book that's on the shelf that's like a butterfly pinned down, you know. By the way, I just finished Rob Bell's book, Everything is Spiritual. And that image he uses, butterfly pinned down, to talk about seminary. So it just popped into my head, and I'm just trying to give credit where credit is due there. That needs to die. And that's not pleasant. It's not. It's really not. Because God, the divine, or another way of saying it is reality with a capital R, whatever is really real, that's what I mean by the whole, the one, God or the divine. We're so small in our capacity to understand such a thing. So we have to undergo a death as well. The death of the divine. Why have you forsaken me? Why did you not intervene when I wanted you to intervene? I said all the right prayers and I was a good little boy and I was faithful and the death of the interventionist God. Or the death of the super friendly liberal hippie God that's gonna smoke weed with you and be your buddy, and just love everybody, man, whatever image you're carrying, or the judgment, that Jesus is really just a harsh judge, or somehow is a stand-in and protects me from the even harsher God the Father judge, or I don't know. Now we're down into the weeds of the images that we carry about the divine. And here's the secret, the irony, I guess. We need them, and they also need to die. We need them to get going. I can say for the first time in my life, I'm 40 or something years old, and I can say for the first time that I'm grateful for the initial images that I had of the divine, of God. Now, I spent many years mocking it, deriding it, putting it down, belittling it, acting like I was above it, like, oh, how stupid, I grew up in fundamentalist Baptist Southern America, how blind they were, which is another way of saying how blind was I, and how blind am I right now in saying that. I'm grateful because it's a starting place. Jesus had some kind of starting place. And terribly on the cross, it's dismantled. It dies. And if it dies, even if our precious images of God, which have become idols, we could say, if they die, something new is, the possibility for something new is present. The seed is under the ground, and time and air and wind and rain and more time and air and wind and rain and sun rays and heat and cold and cycles, and something might just emerge in its place. And Jesus is saying, let's find out. And he's willing to go all the way and say, God, you failed me. Imagine that's your final breath. You failed me. Where were you? That's how courageous I think Jesus is, and how powerful the Christ symbol is. So maybe that's where you are. Maybe you know what I'm talking about when I talk about the death of God. And I think whispering in the wind is Jesus saying, yeah, I know what that's like too. And unless a grain of wheat goes into the ground and dies. So that's point number one. Point number two, story number two, is just a couple of moments contemplating the image of the cross itself. Not as some kind of substitutionary symbol, not as like a Roman element of torture, that's the historical reading, but as a kind of vertical and horizontal paradox. Jesus finds himself cast between the underworld and the upper world, between Hades and hell and paradise and the heavens. And on one side, there's a thief who believes, and on the other side, a thief that mocks, you know. And Jesus is splayed out between the poles of things, taking it in a way, feeling forsaken, but taking it and not resolving it. He even says of his own enemies, forgive them, talking to God, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. Opening himself up to quote the mystics, the coincidence of opposites. There's something about the poles that's unresolved here between the eternal and the temporal. Like, is life eternal? Is God eternal? Is the divine eternal? Is there such thing as the eternal? And also, is there such thing as the temporal? See, both of those things are just right there. Jesus says to the thief, today you'll be with me in paradise. Today there's an eternal, and right now everything about this moment is temporal. We're all going to die. We're all going to die, including Jesus, including the thieves. And something eternal is also present right here today. That's what I mean about this moment. Undergoing something, about the poles, about the paradoxes. So which is it? Is it chaos or order? You know, to some extent, Jesus is experiencing the chaos of, what's that Shakespeare line? The slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Just the way history unfolds, circumstances, political powers, misunderstandings, betrayals by friends like Judas. Yeah, the ordinary chaos of life. And yet, there's also some kind of order. There's some kind of pattern, some kind of meaning in this. You know, that's what I mean by the poles. And Jesus is not choosing one over the other. He's holding both of these things. Between the capacity for evil and the capacity for good, he's wedged between them. He's saying something like, the Christ symbol holds the paradoxes here. I mean, what would you say of your own life? Are you all good? Are you all evil? I mean, who can really say that of anything in life? Can you say it's all chaos? Can you say it's all order? No, you cannot. Now, the ego, of course, back to the ego, wants to parse everything out. Evil people are over there. Good people are over there. Evil people are in the White House. Good people are, I don't know, somewhere else. You see that, I mean, and again, that's just the instinctual nature of the ego, to divide everything out. But the deep self, the deeper self, sees behind those illusions that it's something like both. I have the capacities for darkness, evil, greed, hypocrisy. God, I'm a hypocrite, you know. And the moment you own that is also to own, and I have the capacity to for love and for generosity. So what I'm saying is this. when the seed goes into the ground, when the ego cracks, and we find ourselves in that underworld, underground, womb-like, tomb-like place, one of the things that happens is that we begin to see reality for what it is, and maybe starting with the reality that is my own life. And I think about all the problems right now: race, economic devastation, and a kind of class system. I think about environmental destruction. I think about the scapegoating of nations and skin colors and ethnicities and religions, and that's a lot, right? But once that ego gets cracked, I realize I am a participant in this. I'm a racist. I cause environmental harm. I am privileged and enjoy it and don't want it to change all that much. Maybe a little bit. Maybe I can post about it that I want it to change, but I don't really want to change that much, come on. It's like the illusions we have about ourselves, we have to start swallowing that. But that's not to swing all the way over to one side, it's to hold the pole. And also the moment I find that, I realize I'm not just a racist. I'm just a human. And I have the capacities for compassion and love and generosity and goodness. They're right there. That's to experience, I think, what the symbol of Christ on the cross is going through. We get splayed out like that. We get invited to hold the paradox, the coincidence of opposites, to remain there long enough for the abyss out of which our life dimly emanates to continue to flow. And we're totally transformed in the process. See, if you can say something like, I am both. I am the thief on Jesus's right. I'm a totally disbelieving, anarchist, angry, agnostic atheist. I don't believe any of this. And one part of me says, I believe. Both of those things. When we can own those elements of our own psyche, our own deeper self, we become a whole lot more honest, a whole lot more authentic, and we can take a deep breath. And when we can recognize that we carry these poles, we can turn around and face the complexities of the world that we find ourselves in without dividing everything up between, oh, the believing people are the good people and the unbelieving people are the bad people. We say, no, I see that in myself. And everything belongs, to quote Richard Rohr, everything belongs. See, that's a transformed consciousness. And that's what Jesus is saying. And if you undergo this process, you will reap a great harvest. You will not remain a single seed. Your life will spill out all over the place. And your transformed consciousness will help transform consciousness in general. You'll be a participant in this ongoing evolution of something. I guess that's the question. Do you want to be a participant? And sometimes I think it takes being splayed out like this, like Jesus is talking about. Being both the liberal and the conservative. See, hardly anybody talks like that because we so quickly want to divide it up to one of those is good and one of those is bad. And it's something like yes. See, this is easier said than done, which is why Jesus is a mystic and why he's misunderstood. But also why I think the Christ symbol is powerful and needed now, I think, more than ever. So let me say it one other way, kind of in conclusion. When we hold our own contradictions, when we hold them, and not try to eliminate them, but hold them, once the ego cracks and we're no longer sure who we are anymore, once we can learn to hold our own contradictions, our own hypocrisies, then a bit of our own ego dies. And the illusions that we have about ourselves lifts. And to live like that, a little less blind, is needed, is good. And if there's anything that I think I want to conclude this little series with, yes, but what about Jesus? I want to say, what is it about Jesus? He's inviting you and me and the world and consciousness to undergo something, to undergo a kind of death and resurrection for the transformation of all things. And I hope you'll find in your own small way, not needing to fit into some special category like Christian or not, but I hope you'll find your own way of saying yes to this mysterious process. Thanks for listening. I wish you unraveling in goodness. I wish you descent and return. I wish you death and resurrection. Peace.